Why should we study the New Testament? There's lots of really wonderful reasons that I think we should keep in mind. And so today I'm going to cover three reasons why we should study the Old Testament. And so we're going to dive right into that. Okay, so 3 reasons to keep in mind for why we should study the New Testament. Now, before we get into that, we should think about some common reasons why people think that they should study the New Testament. And really this applies to the whole Bible, but we'll think of it in terms of the New Testament. First, some people think of the New Testament as like the Christian manual, right? So, you have a manual for your car, and it sort of, if something's going wrong, it gives you an idea of what to check. And so the New Testament for some people is like the Christian manual for life. And another way to think about it is that it's just a rule book that, you have a question like, hey, I have this ethical dilemma. I need to know what to do. And so I go to the New Testament for a list of rules that will tell me exactly what I should do. So I have a strained relationship with someone. So I go to one of Jesus's teachings about forgiveness and restoration. And there I have my answer, right? And so you think of the New Testament as a rule book. Now, another approach is to think of the New Testament as a question and answer resource, right? So I have some question about the world, about life, and I want to look to the Bible, I want to look to the New Testament for some guidance on how we should think about that particular question. So these are some common reasons that people think that they should study the Bible and the New Testament, and I don't think any of those are quite right. They make sense on some level, but they're not quite right. Instead, I think that the New Testament contains aspects of all of these approaches. Right? Like you can do that. You can get your questions answered in some ways. You can get some rules for how you should live your life, and certainly there's guidance for what we should do in different situations. But none of these approaches are correct, right? Instead, if we want to study the New Testament well, we need to approach it on its own terms. We need to approach the New Testament as it is, not as we would sort of like for it to be. I mean, it would be nice if there was just a clear table of contents that mapped onto every issue that we will face in life, and then we could just follow it into, we should just flip to the right page, and then we would know the answer to the issues that we're facing. But that's not the way that it is. So why do we study the New Testament? One thing to keep in mind is that we study the New Testament to understand its message. Right, that seems pretty basic, but it isn't always easy to understand the message. So we need to keep that in mind as we move along. So reasons it isn't always easy. So I made a claim there, right? That the New Testament, studying the New Testament isn't always an easy thing to do. And so why isn't it always easy? There's a few reasons. Well, number one, that the New Testament isn't a single book. Right, so we can think of the New Testament, as a portion of this larger book, but the New Testament is actually a collection of 27 ancient documents, right? And so some of them are longer and some of them are shorter, but it's actually a collection of biographies and letters and things like that. It has parables in it, and it has this strange book at the end called Revelation, which is an apocalyptic book. And so the New Testament is actually a collection of documents, which makes it a little bit difficult at times to see how all of these different collections fit together to communicate one message to us. And so that's a challenge. And then, of course, the New Testament has a peculiar relationship to the Old Testament, right? The Old Testament doesn't say anything explicitly about Jesus, and yet Christians from the earliest ages have said that the Old Testament, in fact, is how we know who Jesus is, and that Jesus is actually in every page of the Old Testament. And that's a peculiar claim, right? And it's something that creates this really interesting relationship between the Old and New Testaments, and one that means that Christians and Jews interpret the Old Testament differently. And that is a challenge that we need to acknowledge and we need to explore if we want to understand the New Testament well, right? So that's some reasons why it isn't always easy. Number two, we study the New Testament because it draws us into God's story, right? So we want to know the message is the first reason, but when we begin to know the message, we find that actually studying the New Testament draws us into what God is doing in the world. You see, if we want to fulfill our roles in God's kingdom, we need to know what he calls us to do, right? And so the New Testament is this really interesting collection of documents that as you read it, you begin to see that it actually is making a claim on your life. It's calling you to follow Jesus and to play your role in the kingdom of God. And if we want to do that well, then we need to love the Lord with all of our hearts, as well as and our souls, and especially our minds, right? Knowing our roles requires us to love God with our minds as well as our hearts and our souls. And so we want to be engaged intellectually in the process of knowing what it is that God is doing in the world. So when we study the New Testament, that's an act of loving God with our minds, right? And so studying and learning has always been an important part of the Christian faith. When it is clear that loving God with your mind is an important aspect and something that God calls us to, then the earliest Christians embraced that. And we know this in a few different ways, right? First, if you went to a Christian community in the early days, you would find that there were non-elite people, so just common people who were learning and studying. And that was unique because most of the time schools and tutors were reserved for those who had the means, the financial means to be able to do that. And yet in Christian communities, people gathered around a book, a collection of books and documents, and talked and learned how to live according to God's ways in light of what was being shared with them through the Old Testament and then through the emerging New Testament letters that were circulating. So, and then not only were non-elite people learning, but Christians actually improved on the book technology of their day, which was the codex. So in many ancient societies and for much of history, books were rolled up on scrolls, right? So you had to unroll them, and they were difficult, right? You couldn't just flip to the right page, but you had to learn how to scroll to the right page. But the codex is sort of a precursor to what we have in our book, where you could lay pages on top of each other, and then you could actually flip to the right page. And Christians actually improved on that technology and made a really functional codex where they could find their different books and their different letters more quickly. And so that's just a couple of examples of how early Christians really loved God with their minds and set great examples for us. And then also, as they continued to grow, Christians actually spread that message of the gospel across geographic and ethnic barriers, right? And so they loved God, and then they made sure that as they loved God with their minds, that they actually communicated that to people who lived in different places and had different traditions, and they were able to translate that into a different way of talking to people. And of course, in that process of translation, they put the message into the language of their day, which was Greek, right? So as English is the common language of the world today, Greek was the common language of the world during the time of Jesus. And so the early Christians translated their message into the language of their day, which is Greek. So that's how we know that we are drawn into God's story. But the third reason that we study the New Testament is because it's an act of worship, and we study the New Testament also to engage in God's mission. Like, these are the reasons that we study the New Testament. Studying what God has done for us through Jesus Christ should always lead us into worship, right? So as Christians, when we study this, like, that should just motivate worship in us, right? And so that's one reason why we study the New Testament. But then also studying what God has done for us through Jesus Christ will challenge us to join the mission. Like I said earlier, the New Testament makes a claim on our lives. It's not just an interesting ancient collection of documents. It's something that as we read it, we realize we're called to see ourselves as a part of what's going on. It's been said, that the book of Acts ends while Paul's still alive. It ends sort of abruptly. And the idea many people think is that Luke didn't finish the book because the kingdom of God, the story of the church, is still being written. And so we today are living out a continuation of the events that started with the church in the book of Acts, right? And so when you have that as sort of a core book in the New Testament, then in that way it invites us into the story. We see ourselves in many ways in a continuous relationship with the church, from all the way back to its earliest days. So that's what it will challenge us to be in the mission. But there's a danger, right? So the New Testament calls us to worship and to mission. But if we don't learn to study the New Testament well, we actually run a couple of risks in terms of our worship and our mission. And first is that if we don't learn to study the Bible well, the New Testament well, we'll worship a distorted idea of God, right? We'll worship a God who looks more and more like ourselves in all the ways that is flawed. And it's a way that will ultimately lead us really into idolatry. And it won't be true worship. It'll be a distorted version of worship that is not beneficial to us. And then the second thing is that we'll actually engage in the wrong kind of mission, right? And you see this with people who make the Bible into sort of a political tool for whatever governmental system that they're in. And so we don't want that. Instead, we want to recognize that we're citizens of heaven. We're in a different kingdom. And so the way that we operate in the world is always within God's kingdom first and primarily, and then only secondarily are we citizens of whatever country we're in. And so our allegiance is to God and the way that He wants us to structure our lives. And we need to recognize that no governmental system, no political party will ever perfectly match those things. And the New Testament challenges every system of the earth and says that it's all a flawed and it's all a parody of God's kingdom, and that in fact we need to learn to live in God's kingdom as God's children, which is something that's drastically different than what most people do. And so if we don't learn to study the New Testament well, then we'll end up distorting our worship and distorting the types of missions that we engage in. And so those are three reasons why we need to study the New Testament well. We need to study the New Testament to understand its message, which isn't always easy, but it's a valuable challenge to us. We need to study the New Testament because it is going to challenge us and invite us into God's story, and it's going to invite us into worship and into the mission of God in the world. And those are just a few reasons why I think studying the New Testament is so incredibly important. And I hope that as you pick up the New Testament yourself, that you'll begin to see these reasons as why you study the New Testament as well. That's all for today. If you like this type of content, please make sure to subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you next time.